So the book is called Everything I Learned. I learned in a Chinese restaurant. And as the title implies, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, right? But not just any Chinese restaurant. I like to think of it as the best Chinese restaurant in all of Detroit. And for the people that came yesterday to the other event I had at Skylight, you know the answer to this, so please don't shout it out. But I like to ask, guess how many egg rolls we sold in the course of the 60 years that my family owned this business? Not quite that high. We did sell 10 million egg rolls over 60 years. So it was a very, very popular restaurant. And so this is where I grew up. And for me, this was an oasis because Detroit at that time was going through a lot of difficulties. Not only did you have the struggling auto industry, but you had crack cocaine, you had AIDS. I personally knew 5 people that had been murdered by the time I was 18. But with this Chinese restaurant, my family was able to teach us the values and the skills and the things that we needed to sort of move on with our lives. And so that's the premise of the book. A lot of times, when you read about the Asian American experience, it's really centered on the West Coast, Hawaii, or maybe even New York. And you really don't get a sense that, oh, wow, there are Asians everywhere, right? Like even in the Midwest. Because I like to think of how my family was even in Detroit before there was a Ford Motor Company or even a Motown Music. This was a long time ago. In Detroit, we had this thing called the Detroit Riots or the Detroit Rebellion that happened in 1967. And at that time, my family had already been running the restaurant, which opened in 1940. But for the first time ever, they actually had to close the restaurant for 5 straight days. But during that time period, my parents actually managed to, have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And so without that incident, I don't think I'd be around. And I think that's partly why I think I talk about race and social justice so much.
I think for us at Stop AAPI I Hate, I don't know if you remember, we first talked about your book actually at the White House when there was a celebration. Curtis and Jeff were there along with Cynthia, me, and I think probably 5,000 other people to celebrate really marriage equality. For you in Detroit, can you tell us what Detroit's Chinatown was like? We're not far. For folks who may not know, we're in Little Tokyo. Of course, we're a mile or so from Chinatown in LA. What was that experience like then? And what is it like now? Is it still around? Because we know a lot of Chinatowns have really experienced gentrification and other things. So talk about, if you can, your sense of community and what that meant for you then.
Sadly, Detroit faced a lot of troubles, particularly in the 80s era that I grew up in. Eventually, all the businesses closed down. There weren't many to begin with. I always joke that there were 6 Chinese restaurants and one of them was Indian. You know what I mean? Because there just weren't a lot. Because the original Chinatown actually was much bigger. There was about 4,000 or 5,000 people. But then when they destroyed it, most of the people scattered to the neighbor suburbs. And the one that I grew up in never really had more than a few people in it. So
much of your early upbringing was in a multiracial space, right? And you went from Detroit, from the main part of the city, to Troy, seemingly belonging to then being otherwise. So can you talk a little bit about that transition and sort of how it helped inform you and even the work that you went on to do?
I just remember there was a lot of tension between the blacks and whites, and the most popular phrase growing up was fight between the black and the white. And being Asian, I obviously knew that I wasn't either, right? And so I tried to make friends with both sides. And I say in the book how like trying to play Switzerland only turned me into Swiss cheese, because then they started making fun of me for being Chinese, right? But then in 5th grade, my family moved to Troy, which was a city that was, I would guess, like probably 98% white at that time. I mean, it was really, it was different going from a city to one that was dominated by one other community. And so like the choice is that I had as a kid growing up, where I could feel like, okay, I could try to fit in with multiple different kinds of people, right? Where now suddenly, there was one dominant culture, which is white culture, and I sort of had to fit in there. So that was a transition for me. It was different. So first I should set this up. So one of the ways that I tried to fit in was I became a Republican. I was the Asian Alex P. Keaton, if that means anything to you. I was like, class president, founded the Young Republican Club, the Students Against Smoking, all that kind of stuff. Um, and so, like for my mom was really, she really kept us on a tight leash, um, because she really wanted us to focus on education. And she didn't really let us go out and have friends and things like that. But finally, at some point, I think she realized that in order to get into a good college, you need to have a social life and to make friends. And so she allowed us to actually join clubs and things like that. And, one of the first friends that I made was a kid named Scott, you know, and my mom actually let me go over to his house to play. And so I'm going to share a little story about what happened afterwards. And because this fits, I think, with the work that you all do, right, at Stopping API Hate, which is looking at, microaggressions and also the impact that it has on, Asian Americans, right? Like, how do we deal with these things? The mental aspect, right, of these incidents. And so to set it up, like we had a great time going over to my friend Scott's house. It was a lot of fun. I'd never been to, a friend's house like before. It was really different comparing his house and my family's house, the crazy Chinese house. I won't get into it, but you can read it in the book. But the next day at school, I'll read starting there. So this is, I don't remember what chapter it is. It's the middle section, when I'm in high school. The next day at school, Scott and I had lunch at our usual table, a long orange one to the right of the vending machines, and told our friends from the science club about our afternoon. Citing our back-to-back risk victories, I engaged in a little smack talk. Scott kept giving up Siam. I was getting 2 extra armies every turn. A demoralized Scott tried to change the subject. My parents said they liked meeting you. I don't know why. I chuckled at his joke. Yeah, especially after I kept beating their son at risk. They said you were the first minority they'd ever had in their home. I stopped chomping on my turkey sandwich. Scott's words, quoting his parents, made things feel awkward. Suddenly I felt different, like an outsider. I looked around to see if anyone thought it was odd. None of our friends, all of whom were white, said anything. My mind began to churn. I got frustrated. If Scott's parents had said something clearly racist, I could have called them out on it, but it was these borderline comments that left me tongue-tied. I don't recall how I responded, but I'm sure it was something along the lines of, oh well, tell them I said thanks. This wasn't the first time I found myself confused about race, not knowing how to bring it up or discuss it. Was I overreacting? Was it really just harmless? I guess it was the fact that I'd heard these types of comments so often. Initially, I was able to ignore them or respond with a witty quip that after all these years of living in Troy, as well as the death of Vincent Chin, who was a family friend of ours, I found it hard to just let these things go. Every minor incident, which I would later learn were called microaggressions, felt like the ancient Chinese torture technique of death by 1,000 cuts. The rest of the afternoon sucked big time. I felt unsettled. In calculus, I couldn't focus on the equations written on the board. In third year of French, I couldn't conjugate a single verb. I kept wondering if I should have let Scott know that his parents' comment irked me, but I didn't want him to think I was overreacting. In truth, I was more concerned with protecting his feelings than unpacking mine. At the end of the 6th period, the bell rang, and all the students got up and rushed to the exits. I couldn't wait to get back to the restaurant. I could really use the comfort of some familiar egg rolls. I could already smell the plum sauce drizzling over the piping hot cabbage filling. As I approached the back of the lockers by the stairs where Scott's locker was located, I ducked my head. From the corner of my eye, I saw him waving me over. Want to ride home? I lived 2 miles past Scott's house, so that meant he would have to go out of his way to drop me off. He'd never offered before. Maybe he picked up that I'd felt awkward at lunch. Maybe he just wanted a rematch at risk. I don't know, but I was still processing my feelings. In truth, I didn't want to rock the boat. Life was going great for me at Troy High. I did well in my classes. I had lots of friends. I had added the title of class president to my resume. I worried that if I started making accusations of discrimination, my friends might look at me differently. Would the cheerleaders still say hi to me in the halls? Would my other classmates start to think I had a chip on my shoulder? Resolving my feelings wasn't worth risking what I achieved. So I decided to ignore the situation. I pretended not to hear Scott's offer and tried my best to blend in with the strangers rushing past me. Unlike in a standardized test, there were no simple bubbles to fill in. And so I'm just going to read the first part of the next chapter where I think about this and I resolve these issues.
Let's unpack that a little bit. you talked about it as being sort of a death by marine cuts. This meanness, the impacts. I mean, one thing we are really looking at Stop API Hate is not only hate crimes or civil rights violations, but really the mental health impacts of everyday racism. And what's called weathering that people of color actually experience, right? Physical effects as a result of that everyday racism. So can you say a little bit more about, like, again, moving from a place that you felt where you felt that you belonged to one that was not, and like, could you sense those mental health impacts, or were you just sort of completely weren't brushing them off, but like, in what ways did they sort of inform like your work?
I think at that age, all kids are just trying to fit in, right? I mean, and so you're all insecure, wondering if you're saying the right things, doing the right things, wearing the right clothes. And I think anytime you feel marginalized or otherized, as you're saying, you start to question, the other things you're doing and wondering, like, what are people really saying about me behind my back, right? Like, what are the secret parts? And I think that you don't want to dwell on those things, right? Because you want to fit in. And I try to be a happy-go-lucky person, but it's like I say in this piece, it's like it just starts to build up where you start to feel like, oh my God, what's really going on? So one Sunday morning in the summer of 1982, as I was preparing to enter high school, the four adults were in my grandparents' room, whispering about a fellow member of our family association. Vincent's wedding was set for the following week, but the night before, the 27-year-old draftsman had been in some sort of an accident or altercation at a bar. No one was quite sure, but now we were stunned to find out that he was in the hospital in coma, fighting for his life. Vincent was twice my age, so it's not as if we hung out, but I knew who he was. He was one of the cool Asian guys who were buddies with some of our younger waiters and managers. They liked to hang out around the back of our restaurant. As my parents discussed which flowers brought the best luck and who would visit him first, I wandered into our kitchen to scrounge for some Apple Jacks. There on the counter was the red and white wedding invitation from Vincent and his fiancée Vicky. The date was just a week away. I wondered if we would get better in time. That night, we waited for any coverage on the news, but we didn't see a thing. In the early 1980s, the local stations had one lead story, the city's ongoing economic plight. Domestic car sales were down, factories were shattered, union members were losing their homes. At 17% unemployment, Detroit, the birthplace of the American middle class, led the nation in joblessness. Detroit had fallen and it couldn't get up. In Chinatown, though, we followed our own headlines. It was all about Vincent. Our workers were beside themselves as they felt such guilt for not being there to defend their friend. A stream of ahus and members of the online Chinese Merchants Association dropped by with updates from the hospital. Emotions ping-ponged by the hour, from hope to dread and then back to hope. It was scary and comforting to see so many faces I hadn't seen in years. This time, the elders didn't even bring up my grades or pinch my cheeks or ask about my report cards. After 4 long, tense days, word came back that Vincent had suffered too much brain damage to survive, and his family had decided to pull the plug. The news surprised me. Vincent was young and healthy. Why couldn't his body fight back? What about the doctors? They all had this education and medical expertise. Why couldn't they save him? Over the next few months, details of the night emerged. Vincent had been at his bachelor party at a strip club when 2 white men, who we later learned were stepfather and stepson, came in. After some drinks, words were exchanged between the groups. All of them were tossed out. Soon after, the white men spotted Vincent and a friend sitting outside a McDonald's waiting for their ride. The stepson grabbed Vincent and pinned him down while the stepfather bashed Vincent's head multiple times with a baseball bat. Vincent's last words were, "It's not fair." As the shocked Chinatown coped with the untimely loss of one of our own, my mind kept returning to Vincent's mom, Lily. Her face always had a natural smile, and I had seen her slurping my mom's pork bone soup at the kitchen table in our house. But when I saw her on television, her eyes and mouth read only despair. It was rare to see any Asians on TV, much less in public, exposing their hurt. But Lily epitomized the most universal figure in history, the grieving mother. How could anyone hear her anguish and not think of their own mom? I know I thought of mine. Vincent wasn't the first person I knew who was murdered, nor would he be the last. But his death had the most impact on me.
what I found reading it, some of the sweetest, most sort of poignant stories were around your awareness of your sexuality, right? And like whether it was like, going to the store and looking at the magazine, your friend Virginia, like piercing your ear and what that meant for you. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think it just sort of reminds us too of like, as we come to understand ourselves, and I think that's what so much of this book is, right? You understanding yourself. How do you feel like these parts of the book kind of tell that story about you?
The coming out process?
Mhm.
Yeah, because I start the book at a very young age, like elementary, middle school. I think that that journey at first isn't really, you don't know what it is, right? You're just like, for me, it was just the idea that I was attracted to one other boy. The first kid I was attracted to was actually this Filipino boy. I called the Filipino Fonzie, because he had like, this white T-shirt. It was like so cool, and I just wanted to hang around him. Right? I didn't think of it as like a sexual thing, but I knew there was attraction. But I just thought it's because he was cool. You know what I mean? And I think when you get a little bit older, you start to realize, oh, well, there's a physical component that, not just being in their space, but actually wanting to touch. You know what I mean? And grab, and maybe not even at that point like a sexual, grabbing genitals, but even just hugging or touching or, being in that, being, close to proximity. So I think that it's a natural thing that you just start to unpeel as you get older, right? You start to understand it. And so, growing up in the red light district, you're just exposed to so much more. And so that's why I'm sort of like, my coming out experience is sort of like on steroids, where it's like, yeah. Yeah, it was different.
What inspired you to become an activist? And what were sort of those challenges of childhood, of your growing up years that led to that, or were there other things that were more based on being in Detroit?
No, I really do think that it was the Vincent Chin case, because as I in the section I read to you, so we found out the very next morning that Vincent had been attacked, right? And so as a little kid, if you know somebody that's in the hospital, literally fighting for their life, you're going to try to check the newspapers, see how they're reporting on it, and so that's what I would do. But sadly, the media didn't cover it for a full 12 days. By that time, Vincent had died, the wedding had been canceled, so much had happened, and and then after that one article appeared, another 10 months passed before another article appeared. And meanwhile, I mean, everybody in Chinatown was talking about it. And so I recognized there was this disconnect between what, we were thinking about and what mainstream media was covering, because at that time, all the articles, or so many of the articles they were writing, really were about the struggling auto industry, like the workers and how difficult their lives were. And, when the judge ultimately came back with a sentence of only $3,000 fine and no jail time, I honestly believe that if the media had done a better job of covering our community, I don't think that the judge would have given that sentence. I think that we would be. I just don't think we would have done that. And so what I did, my first act of activism was I would lug the typewriter into the dining room, back when we had typewriters, and I would just type these letters to the editor. None of them ever got published, and none of them got responded to. I'm 14 years old, probably not a very good writer, but yeah, that was my first act, and that's why also I wanted to be a writer, because I understood the importance of narrative, right? Like, who gets to tell the story, whose story is being presented, and so that's why, for my career, I've always tried to pursue that, right? Not just going off to college and starting a literary journal for people of color, but then going off to New York and starting Asian American Writers Workshop. So
Some of the narrative hasn't changed, right? With the Atlanta killings of 6 Asian women, even there, the media wanted to tell a different story. And it was because of activists in Atlanta and many folks around the country that we were able to really shine the light and say, no, this was something more. with your with your documentary about the Vincent murder, you've been touring a lot of college campuses. And so I just wondered if you could reflect on what you've been hearing from younger Asian Americans across the country and college campuses regarding their own experience and how that may be different from your own experience or similar and how that's kind of evolved. Pretty curious.
Hmm. So my first documentary was a film called Vincent Fu, which looked at the Vincent Chi case and the impact that it had on the development of the Asian American community. I made that film more for a personal reason. It started off because my dad had just recently passed away in a car accident back in Detroit, and I was working with TV more at that time, and I just felt like, what would be a story my dad would want me to tell? So that's how that film came about. But it coincided with the election of Obama, right? Because it came out in 2009. And so it was really interesting because when I started touring that around, I've taken that film to like over 500 places, colleges, around the world, literally. And one of the first questions I would often get from the young students back then was, we just elected our first Black president. Why did you move to make this, film, right? In some ways, we've conquered racism in this country, right? And bless their heart, I think that they were serious, right? Because I feel like at that time, that generation really felt like we had overcome racism in this country. But I think anybody who pays attention to the news realizes that has been. And, so I feel like certainly in that film, I think that, for Asian Americans, I feel like there's a lot more students who know about these things, they hear about these things. So I credit a lot of the educators and nonprofits who are doing the heavy work of telling these stories. When I sort of compare what happened with the Vincent Jin case in '82 versus the results of whatever's happening in Atlanta, the one heartening thing was that I feel like our communities come much further along, in terms of being able to push back to some of these things. Because when we think back on the Vincent Chin case, right, like we pretty much lost, right? Everything. These people never served anything in jail. But so when you look at Atlanta and other recent hate crimes, the community has just been so much more effective, right? Like not only in terms of keeping the story alive, because we have so many more Asian Americans now working in the media, right? We have Asian American celebrities who are using social media to keep these stories alive. We have a whole network of Asian American nonprofits out there who are advocating, working with these communities to document and report these crimes. We have Asian American politicians that are able to advance legislation. We even have Asian American business people who are now starting to donate money more, right? And so I think, for me, it's sad that I think that we'll always face some type of discrimination, right? But at least our community is better to stand up. So.
For our community, this is so important to see a book like this in print, to see our stories told. And so I want to thank you for doing that for us and telling your story. And that I really hope and believe that you have opened the door for so many in this audience to tell their story.